She said, we're going to walk and roll. I'm like, yes, girl. Yes, we are going to walk and roll. She has dementia. And, the brain is just a tricky and fascinating thing, how it flies in and flies out. But God bless my dementia mom, Karen. She's not just dementia. She was the very good quintessential. She was always right there, emotionally available mom. You could go to her with anything. My sister was such a not awful teenager, but she was such a partying teenager, I should say. She's never going to watch this, don't worry. But my sister was such a rock and roll teenager and partied a lot, and so she trained my mom really, really well on how to handle crises. So by the time I was a teenager 3 years later, all I had to do was say, Mom, I'm going to so-and-so's house. We may be drinking, but we're going to stay there. And she would be like, I'm glad you were honest with me. Please don't drink too much and stay where you are, and if you need me, I will come and get you. She was that mom. She was the mom where I'd come home and I'd be out doing stuff, and my friends would be at the house just hanging out talking to Mom. And I'd say, I didn't know you were coming. They'd say, we just wanted to come and hang out with your mom. So that's my mom's story. But now we're going to get on to higher profile moms. And of course, the nugget at the end is going to be that we really are all rock and roll moms. If we choose to take the mama path, we're all rock and roll stars. But here's what Beyonce says about her mom. She says, my mom is one of those people that you feel honored to meet. And no matter who you are, you fall in love with her because she is spiritual, she's inspiring, she's strong, she's funny, she's creative, she's talented, she's everything that I want to be. And of course, Beyonce may not be a rock star right now, but she certainly is a #1 selling country music artist right now. So watch out, rock goddesses, because Beyonce's coming. She's so creative, and I don't know if you've listened to any of her music, any of you, but I'm telling you right now, this new country album especially, stripped down, bare bones, back to its roots country. And I was never a huge, I always liked Beyonce, but I didn't go out and buy all of her music. But gosh, recently, I just have so much respect for the creative power that she is. She and Taylor Swift both. Women can change the world, but I'm not going to start on that tangent. I'm just going to say that God bless Beyonce and God bless her mommy for creating her and her siblings and for how lovely they are and how they are showing up in the world as art expressing in its highest form. So the first actual rock goddess that I'm going to talk about is Chrissie Hynde. Many of you may know her from her band, The Pretenders. She has hits like In the Middle of the Road and I Went Back to Ohio, but my city was all gone. She was actually at Kent State University when the shootings took place, and one of her very best friends was one of the people that got shot. And not soon after that, she left the United States. She had it. She's like, nope, I'm out of here. And she took the next 10 years and she traveled. Her route to success was very circuitous. She went all around the world. She bopped around in England and Europe. She bounced here. She bounced there. She was actually a music journalist before she became she was always a musician, but for money, she actually was making money as a music journalist. When she landed in London for a few years, she worked at a huge fashion house in London, which is why she always looked so put together and super fly, because she had that fashion goddess inside of her, and she learned from the fashion house that she was in. But she had many other careers before she formed the band The Pretenders in 1978. She had auditioned for other bands, and none of it ever stuck. She either didn't get in or she got into a band and it just didn't last. Well, 10 years of this, bouncing around, finding herself, figuring out who she was, and then she came back to the States. She put her band, The Pretenders, together, and suddenly they were off like hotcakes, man. They were rising. And very soon into it, as she was gaining national success after a couple of years, she met Ray Davies of the Kinks. And do you know that they had a baby girl together? I did not know this. 2 years later, she was with another man, Jim Kerr, who was a singer of Simple Minds, she decided to marry Jim Kerr, and they had another daughter together. So she has two daughters that were born in the 80s. They're probably about my age by now. Well, not what am I saying? They're my daughter's age, not my age. What am I kidding? I was born in 67. Flashback to my rock and roll days. But even though she slowed down some with each daughter, she's very quick to say that she never missed a beat as the babies were babying and she was breastfeeding. She tells stories about being backstage, breastfeeding, going on stage and rocking out, and then coming right back up and picking up her babies and being mommy again. And that's just what she did. People did what they had to do and then went right back to being the moms. She didn't miss a beat. She was always implacable about her role as a mother, and she didn't flinch. In all of the interviews and the videos that I read and heard, she was always implacable and did not ever once complain about being a mom or that it was difficult. She was always very joyful about her kids, and she was right there with them. They were in the tour bus with her as she traveled, especially until they were about 5 or 6 and started school. As babies, they were right there with her. So they didn't miss her at all. She was hands-on. The next mom I'm going to talk about, you may not consider a rock goddess, but it's Linda McCartney, the wife of Sir Paul. She was Lady Linda McCartney. Linda Eastman McCartney. I'll burst the urban myth. She's not part of the Eastman Kodak family. She never, although the press tried to make her out to be, one of the Kodak family members came up to her and asked her at a party. She didn't know who he was. He's like, so I hear you're related to Eastman Kodak. She's like, no, that's just the press being silly. He's like, I'm glad you're saying that because I am so-and-so, or Kodak, or whatever his name was. And he's like, I'm glad to know that you're not the one spreading those rumors. But Linda McCartney was a very gifted and talented goddess in very many aspects. She was a professional photographer. She was actually the first female photographer to land a cover on Rolling Stone magazine. Her subject was Eric Clapton. But she was the very first female photographer to get a cover on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, which I find fascinating. But she was a creative spirit, and she was willing to explore all art forms. And in an interview with her daughter Mary, we discover that as a mom, Linda supported artistry and creativity with all of her children. And Mary says they were all photographers, and they all drew, and they all did plays and did musicals. And of course, what else would you expect with Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney as your mom and dad? They were super gifted kids, and they saw that emulated for them, and so they did it as well. They followed suit. They followed the inspiration. In another recent interview with Paul and his two daughters, Mary and Stella, they were promoting a vegan cookbook that Linda McCartney had written. I had no idea. Do you know that she wrote the very first vegetarian cookbook released in the United States? Back in the 60s. That's how cool she was. She just had her finger on the cutting edge of everything, and she's just this unassuming chick that we all kind of associate with singing backups and Paul McCartney and Wings, but she had no musical training before she met Paul, and just under his gentle tutelage and guidance, she learned just enough to be able to go on tour with him. And she had just enough pitch, contrary to what the tapes that were released like 10 years ago try to make her out that she wasn't a very good vocalist. You can hear her voice on all of the songs. That's her playing on a lot of the stuff, especially if you're watching live clips of Paul McCartney and Wings. That's really her playing piano. She had no musical background until then. And she had the chutzpah to go out and just, I'm going to be a rock goddess now. Why not? Why not? Just so much respect for her. But the daughters both talked about her grace and her willingness to dialogue with people using her keen intellect. She was a loving and beautiful example to the kids. So now let's talk about one of my all-time favorites, Tina Turner. We've all heard of Tina Turner. You know, the Proud Mary. Much to her chagrin, that's what a lot of people remember her as, but they also remember her as the iconic middle-aged woman that made a huge comeback in the late 80s, early 90s, and went on to have a phenomenal career throughout the rest of her life. And God rest her soul, she passed away recently. But she had an interview with Oprah Winfrey, and I read that interview and was just crying through the whole thing. Tina Turner's mom left the family when Tina was only 11 because it was a violent situation, and her mother and father were fighting, and her mother was being abused. So the mother left without a word, disappeared. And her dad left not too soon after that, and she was basically left alone to raise herself. She eventually met Ike Turner when she was very young, and she lived in a severely abusive relationship with him until her biological sons were in high school. Now, not only did Tina raise herself up to this point and was already a successful rock goddess, she adopted Ike's 2 sons from a former marriage, and she had 2 biological sons with him. And she had to leave them without a word when they were in high school in order to save her own life because she was being so abused she couldn't stay. The reason she had the strength to leave is that, seeing as how her mother had left the family when she was so young, Tina had done her very best to maintain until the boys were older. And upon finally leaving for good, she knew it would impact the boys. And she hoped that they would one day understand. There are all sorts of news stories out there about that, but that's not what this talk is about. By the grace of God, she discovered Buddhism while she was still with Ike. And that saved her life, and it gave her a path forward. And actually, during a studio session, she was chanting at the end of a song, and it was so hip and so cool. Ike had never heard anything like that before. He gave her a fistful of cash and said, "Baby, that was fantastic. Here, go buy yourself something." And she said she laughed about it at the time because that was not like Ike at all. And she said to herself, wow, this chanting stuff really works. And she stuck with it. And after a couple of years of breathing and practicing her Buddhism and chanting, she started getting stronger, and that's when she knew she had the strength to leave. But she knew it was such a dangerous situation that she couldn't tell anyone. And actually, their lawyer is the person that came and got her. She was living in Texas at the time, and came and got her and took her to L.A. and set her up and gave her the money she needed, the seed money she needed to start on her own. But here's what Tina said in an interview with Oprah about spirituality. She says, if you practice any kind of spirituality, it moves you to stages where you gather other ways of communicating. And she goes on to say, I believe all religion is about touching something within ourselves. It's all one thing. If we could all realize this, we would make a change right now in this millennium. This was a recent interview. So God rest her soul. She did go on to find happiness and peace with a new partner towards the end of her days, and she lived out a phenomenal life. Whether or not she resolved with her children, I'm not sure. I didn't even try to go there. But our next moms are Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart. Barracuda, Magic Man, What About Love? Now, I'm a child of the 80s, and boy, when they had their big comeback around 1987, 1988, oh boy, the big hair, the What About Love? I mean, man, I couldn't get to all of the songs, or you wouldn't have had a talk today, you would have just had a concert. But Nancy Wilson, she's the blonde, and she's the guitar player's sister. She says this, she's the mother of twin boys, and she says, the hardest thing I ever did was trying to figure out how to balance work and motherhood. A large part of it depends on your relationship with your partner, if you're fortunate enough to have a solid partner. Now, fortunately, she's been married to Cameron Crowe of Rolling Stone magazine fame. He wrote and directed the movie Almost Famous and is now a burgeoning director and writer. And they just figured it out together. They figured out together how to make it work. They took each day as it came and just said to themselves, a way will be shown, and it was. Her sister Ann adopted 2 children and has been a single mom from the beginning. And she and Nancy both talk, just like Chrissy Hind, about how great it was when the kids were smaller and they went on the tour bus with them. Because they had the whole family on the tour bus. They had the 2 moms, all the cousins were together, their staff and crew were there, and it was like a traveling family, like the Partridge Family, you know? But she talks about how fun it was to have the kids there and be in mom mode, and then especially when the children got older and could actually attend the shows, how the kids would come out and watch them perform and just be blown away, like, that's mom? What? But Anne tells a story about she was many times standing out on stage, belting out. And Ann Wilson is one of my all-time favorites, too. Talk about a phenomenal powerhouse rock goddess, this woman and her sister, just phenomenal musicians. But Anne says in an interview, I remember one time standing out on stage and I was belting out one of our songs, and at the same time my daughter was 18 years old and she was going through some stuff, and my mouth was singing the song because it had sung it a million times, but my brain was fixated on how can we resolve this? How can I fix this situation? And she said, so there was never a time when I was this or that. She said, I was always this and that. And she and Nancy both say that. They both chose to be moms, and they had the means with which to raise their kids in a stable environment, and that was very fortunate for them. The next woman I'm going to talk about is someone you may not have ever heard of, but you have heard her and her bass playing on probably about 80% of all music that was recorded before the year 2000. Her name is Carol Kaye, and she is a world-famous bass player. She's part of the LA studio musician group called the Wrecking Crew. She's played on over 10,000 tracks. She's probably the most recorded studio musician in the history of recorded music. And not just the most recorded female musician, but the most recorded bassist ever. Over 10,000 tracks. Frank Sinatra, Glenn Campbell, the Ronettes, all of the Beach Boys songs, anybody that you can think of, Rod Stewart, you name it. She's played on all of it. And as a primary bassist for the Wrecking Crew for over 6 decades, she's played on over 10,000 tracks, and she was a single mom, and she couldn't do late-night gigs anymore. And back when the boys were little bitty and babies and she was still married, her husband said to her, now bear in mind, this is early 60s, probably even late 50s. She's in her 90s now, I think. But her husband said to her, I don't want you staying out late all night. We have boys to raise. And at that point, she started finding odd jobs during the day to help put food on the table. She landed a job at one of the big LA studios. And one day, one of the bass players couldn't show up for a session. She's like, hey, I know how to play bass. They're like, okay, girl, we'll try you. And she goes in there and lays it down in one take. And from that point on, she was in. And she was making the money, too. And very, very highly respected by musicians all over the world. Any of the top musicians on the planet alive today know exactly who Carol Kaye is. And she never chose to lead a rock and roll lifestyle. She just saw her primary role as a mom. She just wanted a gig that could put food on the table for her boys once her husband left. And she was a single mom, and she kept doing it. She didn't do the evening gigs until they were older. I have a couple more moms. Rita Moreno. The Rita Moreno, in her 90s now, is speaking out about the importance of safe reproductive medical care for women, especially since the Supreme Court, I'm not going to get all political, but since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, Rita Moreno has come out in her later years. And she talked with Variety magazine about way back in the early 60s when she was pregnant with her boyfriend's baby, the boyfriend being Marlon Brando. And it went very badly. They decided that they weren't going to have the baby. They were both just starting out their careers. They were just gaining traction. They were successful. They had used protection. It didn't work. And they decided they didn't want the baby. And it was still very early on. And so Marlon found a great doctor for her. She actually had, at the time, what was the best medical care she could have received, and yet it went horribly wrong. And it took her a couple of years to recover. It was not good. And they actually had the means with which to get good health care, as good as it could be back then for women seeking this. But it was a miracle that she didn't die. And She did go on to marry. A few years later, she left Marlin and met Leonard Gordon, her lifelong husband, who she remained married to her whole life. And together they had a daughter. They had a healthy daughter that is alive and thriving. But she's become very outspoken about the importance of safe reproductive rights. And I just thought it was important today that not all mom stories have happy endings. Some of them don't have happy beginnings. And so it's important to recognize everyone making the best choices they can at the time that they're making them, and being able to forgive, being able to move forward, and again, being able to find happiness and lessons and inspiration where we can find it, through our artists, through our musicians, through our friends and neighbors. When I was growing up, I was a latchkey kid. My mom was a single mom, and we had neighbors all around, and some of them were home during the day, and if I was ever locked out, or I'd just go down to Ginny and Tim's house, or I'd go over to Bonnie and Kenny's house. There was always somewhere to go to check in. It was a network. We were all connected. Sometimes it does take a village. So the last mother I'm going to talk about is actually my very most favorite rock and roll icon vocalist, because she's so versatile. She's one of the most Grammy Award-winning artists of all time across multiple genres, much like Beyonce is doing now, Linda Ronstadt. Many of you may be surprised to know that she's a mom. I'm telling you that I have been a huge fan of Linda Ronstadt since I was 12 years old. I remember standing in the living room with no one home and putting the albums on and just belting out, "Love is a rose, but you better not take it." Oh, you know, I was singing all the songs back then. Well, I didn't even realize. I just looked up on a lark to see if Linda Ronstadt, if there was any information or why she may have chosen not to be a mom, because you never saw anything about her kids in the papers or on TV interviews or anything. In fact, the only information on them is that she adopted them in 1993 and 1994. And the daughter's name is Mary. She's the same age as my daughter, 31. And her son's name is Carlos. There is zero public information on them, which means she has worked very hard in her entire life of her children to make sure they had a private life and to make sure that they were protected. And even today, you go on Facebook, you look around, you go on the internet, there's nothing available on these kids. Now, she did just release a new biography called Simple Dreams, and it is available now. I just saw a recent interview online, and I think that book, it didn't just come out this year, I think it came out last year. But maybe she says something about the kids in that interview, in that book, I'm not sure. But she never did marry. And she was very vocal in her early interviews in the 70s and 80s saying, hey, if I choose to be a mom, maybe I'll just be a mom on my own. You don't necessarily need to have a man to have a baby. I mean, you do, technically. But she said, I have the means and I can do it. You know, if I choose to be a mom, I'll pursue that path on my own if I need to, and that'll be just fine. She said, I found multiple interviews where they were asking, the typical male interviewer, so are you ever going to get married? Are you ever going to have kids? I don't know why they don't say this to men, but a lot of women, that's the first thing they ask you, even young women. When are you going to get married? When are you going to have kids? But the thing that makes me respect Linda Ronstadt even more now is that I found zero information about her children, which means she was a hugely successful mom in keeping her kids protected and making sure they had a normal life. And I just love her even more now because of that. So all of this to say that there are a plethora of mommies in this world. There are the mommies that are right there. There are the mommies that left. There are the other women or figures that come into your life that maybe take their place. Or by the grace of God, you find it within yourself and you survive and you thrive. We are all as God created us, the mommies and us. And maybe we are a mommy and us too, mommy and a child. Some women just automatically have a natural nurturing way about them, and some women don't. And sometimes, especially back in the day, women didn't have a choice. They pretty much got married and had babies, and that's it. Some of them were strong enough to stand their ground. Some of them were brave enough, like Linda Ronstadt and Ann Wilson, to just not ever get married at all. That was their path. But there are many paths to motherhood in this world. All moms who choose to dig in and participate are rock and roll goddesses. They deal with the messy. They deal with the slick and the glamorous. They deal with the prom dresses and the hair that's gone bad on the way to prom. I'll never forget that year when Kelsey's junior prom, she showed up to the party before prom and she was sobbing all over her makeup. Her hair had gone wrong. We deal with that. We're the people that deal with that. There's lots of different hats that moms wear. And if you had an absentee mom or a mom who just naturally did not have the nurturing gene, like my mom's mom, sometimes it skips a generation. My mom became a really, really awesome mom. I don't know how she did it, but she did it. And she was just naturally an effusive, and still is, an effusive and bubbling and lovely personality. In every aspect of our lives, but especially as moms, we all do the very best that we can with the abilities that we have. Moms are expected to be every woman. And as much as I wish I had time to learn, I'm every woman, that could have been the big closer. I didn't have time to learn it this week. But I will leave you in saying I celebrate all of you. I celebrate, and if you're a man in this room today, I celebrate your mommies. I celebrate the women in your life. For all of the ladies in the room, I celebrate you in whatever capacity you are showing up in the world. God bless us all as we connect and we work together to make this world a better place. And a special shout out to ladies today. Namaste. Thank you.